Assalamu alaikum and good morning everyone. My name is Mahmoud Rafi. I will be presenting Module 2 Assignment 2. The topic is ROV System Safety using HIRARC. HIRARC, which stands for Hazard Identification, Risk Assessment and Risk Control, is one of the safety management tools that is used to communicate about safety in specific operation or process. It consists of sub-activity of the process or operation, hazard identification and risk assessment. The hazard identification column will contain identification of hazard, risk and effect to the specific sub-activity, while the risk assessment column will contain likelihood, severity and risk rating of the activity. The risk assessment will have two columns for before and after a risk control recommended action is taken. Besides that, there is also a legal regulations column that stated which laws should be complied within the activity. This is a sample of HIRARC form on launch and recovery system, which has been categorized into several sections. First is sub-activity, and then it can be classified into hazard identification, which is subcategorized into hazard, risk and effect. And the next is current risk control that has been taken, then followed by risk assessment, which is subcategorized into likelihood, severity and risk. Then legal requirement that needs to be followed, then there is a recommended action to control risk and assessment after recommended action has been taken. First sub-activity is HPU maintenance, that is identified as chemical hazard, and the risk is oil spill and the effect is slip. So the current risk control is firmly tightened end-to-end fitting, and the risk assessment of it is likelihood is 3 wood and severity is 3 and the risk calculated is 9. The legal and other requirement is Environmental Quality Act 1974 for hydraulic wastage, and the risk control for recommended action is to use correct size of O-ring. And after the action has been taken, the risk assessment likelihood is 2, severity is 1 and risk calculated from this is 2. Second sub-activity is wiring, and the hazard identification is electricity, and the risk is tripping and effect is electric shock. And the current risk control is follow the current electrical diagram prior to connect the wire. And the risk assessment of if its likelihood is 4 and the severity is 4 and the risk calculated is 16. And legal and other requirement for it is Factory and Machinery Act 1967 ROV, and risk control recommended action is to double check the electrical connection with diagram, and the risk assessment after the action taken is likelihood is 2 and severity is 1 and the risk is calculated is 2. And the next sub activity is umbilical cable, and the hazard identified is physical hazard and the risk is cable parted and the effect is trip. So the current risk control is to firmly arrange the cable with barricade line, and the risk assessment likelihood is 4 and the severity is 3 and the risk calculated is 12. And legal and other requirement about it is Factory and Machinery Act 1967 ROV, and the risk control recommended action for it is to align the umbilical nearly and barricaded. After the action taken, the risk assessment is of its likelihood is 2, severity is 1 and the risk calculated is 2. And the next sub activity is disassembly of launch and recovery system. So the first safety identification hazard is safety, and the risk is launch and recovery system collapse. Effect is maybe could be fatality. So the current risk control is to ensure follow instruction as per SOP for technical understanding on launch and recovery system, and the risk assessment for current likelihood is 4 and the severity is 5 and the risk is very high, which is 20. Legal and other requirement for this activity is Factory and Machinery Act 1967 ROV, and the risk control recommended action taken is follow SOP for launch and recovery system. Risk assessment after the action taken is 2 and the severity is 1 and the risk calculated is 2. And the next sub activity is C fastening, and the hazard identified is safety. The risk is launch and recovery system may collapse, and the effect could be a fatality. And the current risk control is using doubler plate for C fastening to strengthen the launch and recovery system's foundation. So the risk assessment is of its likelihood is 4, severity is 5, and the risk is 20. Legal and other requirement for this activity is Factory and Machinery Act 1967, and the risk control recommended action taken is welding 3 to 5 laps on wheel joint in between launch and recovery system foundation and vessel deck. And risk assessment after the action taken is of its likelihood is 2, severity is 1, and the risk is 2. Next sub activity is docking the TMS and ROV, and the hazard identified is safety, and the risk is people thrown away, and effect is injury. So the current risk control is advice and warning to don't stand on the identified potential hazard area, and the risk assessment of its likelihood is 2, severity is 2, and the risk calculated is 4. And the legal and other requirement for it is OSHA 1994, and the risk control recommended action for it is to barricade the identified potential hazard area besides the TMS, and the risk assessment after the action taken is of its likelihood is 1, and the severity is 1, and the risk calculated is 1. I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.